Good afternoon, disaster and emergency management leaders and futurists and business continuity crisis management leaders. Thanks for joining us this afternoon on Hazardscape Live with Donna Dupont and John A. Sweeney. All right, now I'll caveat this with my main desktop computer fan burnt out last night, so I had a good business continuity plan and my backup system's in place. But if I'm a little laggy on this show, it's my fault, and it's likely my computer. And if you are in, make sure you let us know where you're from. What's the weather like? Let us know you're out there, and ask any questions. Submit them in the comments. So I'm going to welcome to the show Donna and John, and let's go with. I want to pick the best of you because I don't want my large head there. Okay, awesome. There we go. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Brad.
I'll let you introduce your
Hi.
Hello. I'll let you guys introduce yourselves because I didn't bring up your bio to start. So Donna, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So my name is Donna Dupont. I'm a emergency management professional, but also I work in the space of strategic foresight and futures for Purple Compass. And a lot of my work is focused around opportunities to integrate foresight and design methodologies within traditional emergency management planning approaches. And
awesome. Yes, purplecompass.ca.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Okay. And John.
Hi, everyone. I'm John Sweeney. I'm currently based in Minsk, Belarus. So it's certainly been an exciting past few months. I work with Westminster International University in Tashkent, Uzbekistan as a senior research fellow and visiting professor. I wear lots of different hats. So I'm the foresight advisor for Interpol. I'm part of this group, like Donna as well, called the Global Swarm, a group of futurists all around the world focusing on participatory futures. And I spent the last 10 years looking a lot at policy and futures and foresight and how governments can be a little more anticipatory and confront exactly what we're going to talk about today, which is this idea of the black swan.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Donna and John were on the show back in the summer and went over participatory futures and Nesta, and we really got a really good insight as to what it means to be a futurist and the work they do. And since then, Donna came into the Hazardscape Virtual Hub and delivered a presentation on one of the future cell spotlights. I think it was COVID and wildfires. Is that the one you did?
Well, we did a broad one just on resiliency in emergency management with a couple of different highlights of different projects. Yeah.
Yeah, and so they're back today, and this is actually very timely because certainly something I'm hearing, at least in Canada, is governments are stretched very thin. A lot of not-for-profit boards are having to adjust the last 9 months in terms of their strategy and maybe some of the programs they deliver. And a lot of those organizations are tied to disaster risk reduction efforts, emergency management. So this was a very timely presentation because I think if someone who's watching is either a board member or a board chair or a committee member, this is definitely going to be very helpful. And I think disaster governance is an area where we need to spend a little bit more time focusing on as a community. So I'm gonna let you take over, John, with your slide deck and just go through a few. And if you're listening, just joining in, we've got Donna Dupont and John Sweeney with us talking about governance in Age of Black Swans. Please submit your comments or tell us where you're from, say hello, and we'll take questions throughout the episode. So why don't you start us off, John?
That sounds great, Brad. Yeah, we've got a slide deck, but we really want to keep it conversational. So we're going to be bouncing ideas off each other, going back and forth a little bit, trying to open it up. So we absolutely look forward to comments and questions as we go. When we discussed what we wanted to talk about and the framing for this, I thought it was really important that I was pretty clear about some of my assumptions up front. So I spent 4 years working for a group called the Center for Postnormal Policy and Future Studies. And that was a group that has really spearheaded this idea that we're going to talk a bit about today, which is the notion of post-normal times. But I'm also a product of a particular program in the United States at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, which is called the Manoa School of Future Studies. So those really shape my approach to thinking about the future. And both of them are really built on the backs of a long-standing tradition of looking at how to make governance more anticipatory, disciplines like future studies or strategic foresight, and how to bring that really down to practice. I think the backdrop for most everything now is, how are we confronting, of course, not just the health crises, but the variety of other crises. And what I love about this image is it really hits on the dual nature of the crises, certainly that we see in a place like the US, which is misinformation, disinformation. And clearly, it's a global issue in a variety of ways. But I thought it was a really good reminder that, at the end of the day, when we're thinking about governance, we're thinking about politics. And one of the things that my advisor, Jim Dater, has always said, the challenge at the heart of governance is, the future doesn't count because the future doesn't vote. So it's a real struggle to make governance more anticipatory and more forward-looking. And I think this image is no greater reminder of that. Donna, do you want to jump in?
No, I'm good. I'm good right now.
That's an interesting, because I think anyone who deals with politics or works in government or whatever, like there's that 4-year election cycle. So and you'll probably get into this a little bit, but I want to make sure we address that, because when you're dealing with politicians that only think in 4-year terms, and really they probably think of more like in 2-year terms, because they take a year to onboard and do whatever they do, and then take a year to campaign almost. Like they're really only working for 2 to 3 years max.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. Because, if you have any kind of new commitment politically, as you said, the onboarding and then to implement it, you need to show results, right? Yep. Well before the next election cycle. And so very much a very short time frame when it comes to thinking about the future. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, and you find that, I think, across different sectors. So whether it's a election cycle, a strategy cycle, a funding cycle, there is this tendency to allow the bureaucracy, if you will, or the kind of nuts and bolts. When I worked at the International Federation Red Cross with Crescent, the joke was always the bean counters run the place. And you find that there is this sense of, the only things that are possible within the context of the familiar and the existent. And so that, that allows a certain kind of innovation to happen, but it also, of course, creates a constraint. And I think there was something interesting that happened earlier this year. The kinds of conversations that people were having, of course, were quite different. But the one thing that was interesting to me is everywhere you looked, there was the idea of the black swan. So this is from March of this year, Sequoia, which is a famous venture capital firm from the US. And then even in the Wall Street Journal, you also saw, reports from universities, different news outlets talking about this idea of the black swan. And I will say this: when you have the Herald Tribune and Supply Chain Management Review talking about black swans, you know that we have reached peak black swan. So we've saturated this idea of the black swan has now become everywhere and anywhere. And I think that's important, but I think I wanted to dig in a little bit to kind of, well, what do we mean by a black swan? And actually, part of it is to kind of, challenge this notion of there isn't just one kind of swan. The black swan, of course, is a metaphor for the outlier event that catches us completely off guard. But there are gray swans and white swans, and I like this dirty white swan and the red swan and the black turkey. I mean, these are, at the end of the day, just different conceptual lenses that really challenge us to see and understand, why are we thinking about things in a certain kind of way, and how is the sense making that we're doing, opening up certain possibilities, but also closing other possibilities.
Yeah. Okay. This whole discussion around black swans has really also stimulated my thinking as well. And I started to do a lot more research around, how are people understanding or perceiving black swans? And so it's really interesting because two people could, have similar experiences, but one could label that a black swan event and the other one no, maybe it's a different kind of category because, perhaps they have a more expanded lens of the way they look at, change and towards the future. And so they may have noticed some of these signals early on. And so they are not caught off guard or surprised. But there are some where if you have a very narrow lens in the way that you look towards the future, there could be a lot of things that you would label as black swan that others may not agree with, right? May have a different perspective.
Yeah, that's actually a good point because I was just involved in a LinkedIn conversation yesterday around the fact of how far North America is behind in using virtual reality as a work and training and learning solution compared to the UK, Germany, and we're 5 to 8 years behind because there's been a belief in North America that training has to be in person, especially in emergency management world, first responder world. It has to be in person. You have to get together in a room and train. Well, that thinking has really held us back from being able to keep preparedness operations going through this pandemic because groups are just finally figuring out how to deliver courses through Zoom, which, there were universities and others doing that like 5 years ago. So yeah, what was a black swan to some was maybe not to others. So absolutely good conversation.
And I think that's something that's really, Donna's really hit on the most important piece, which is the critical nature of perception. So, why are we seeing it a certain way and how do we make sense of it? I don't think that, and this is really quite interesting. So Nassim Taleb, who is the kind of, seen as the guru of the black swan, had come out and said, the virus was not a black swan. Because of course many people had discussed it and talked about it, but my reaction to that is, wait a second, of course, like you can't universalize it, right? If we're talking about a conceptual lens, a way of making sense of something, there's no universal idea of the black swan. So it's important to understand why it would be that way for one and not for another, and this kind of, the importance of perspective, the importance of context, trying to have that sense-making aspect of understanding things being a little more critical is really at the heart of the idea of post-normal times, and to try to bring governance up to speed a little bit, because of course now we realize that the crises aren't stopping. We're seeing wave after wave of these varieties of changes, and we're seeing the cascading effects. Whether we're talking about potential mental health crisis or the long effects of COVID over time. We need better ways to for governance to be a bit more anticipatory, and to sort of catch up, if you will, to the times.
Yeah, absolutely. And Stephen, we'll put the source for the swan and turkey guide in the comments after the show. We'll put that in there, so there's a link to it or something, I'm sure. So we'll take care of that.
Yeah, and I think a lot of governments do have a sense that we are in this post-normal time, and I love this kind of very standard definition from Zia Sardar, who coined the phrase post-normal times, that we seem to be in this in-between period where the old orthodoxies have really, are dying and have really shown to not be fit for purpose. But we really don't have a sense as to what the new ones are yet. So we kind of seem in that kind of in-between stage where things are in a state of chaos, almost continuously. And this is why actually, a lot of the frameworks that I think have a lot of utility is about seeing things from these different perspectives. So I never just talk about black swans. I always talk about swans, elephant, and jellyfish. Those are three kinds of metaphors.
I was excited for, because I didn't know what a jellyfish, a black jellyfish. I never heard that before. What is a black jellyfish? Because I'm really curious for that. I've not heard it, and I didn't Google it before this.
Okay. So you want to go ahead, Donna?
No, you start. Go ahead. You start.
Okay. So let me give you a few anecdotes. Oshkarnan nuclear facility is the largest nuclear reactor in Europe, and it had to shut down for a little while because jellyfish do something called blooming, where you essentially have sometimes jellyfish hatching, or sometimes because of tides, you have thousands of jellyfish come into a certain coastal area at one place at one time, and they clogged actually the intake of the nuclear power plant. Now jellyfish have done this, and this, blooming for, millennia, and this is what they do. But of course, humans like to build things in coastal areas. The world has about 430 commercial nuclear reactors. Many of them are susceptible to this kind of a particular threat or risk. Jellyfish have actually forced aircraft carriers to leave port. So the USS Ronald Reagan was in Brisbane, Australia a number of years ago, and it had to leave because of what they called was an acute case of fouling. They had to move some events from the Sydney Olympics a few years ago. And the whole metaphor here is that it's the thing that starts small, but quickly escalates into a state of chaos. And we know there's chaos in the seas because climate change is making the waters more acidic and making them warmer, which is perfect for jellyfish. That's why there are 3 little jellyfish there. They're kind of growing and proliferating. So the whole idea of the black jellyfish is it's the thing that starts really small that quickly escalates over time. Sometimes we talk about a positive feedback loop, and it then leads to a state of chaos.
Yeah.
That's like David in Prometheus from the Alien movies, where he said all small things, all big things start with a small thing, and that's where he put the alien DNA in the guy's drink. So
yeah, yes,
okay, that's
yes.
Absolutely.
Yes,
Okay.
and absolutely. And just to add, so it's the things we know, like there are things that occur naturally in the environment, and then something shifts within the external environment, and those conditions shift, and then all of a sudden you have more turbulence, more growth. And as John said, that turbulence can lead to chaos, and that chaos is what creates instability within the system, whether it's a nuclear power plant or other types of structures in the environment. So it's known for its rapid nature of growth and that's leading to chaos. So it's something that is worth really understanding and keeping an eye on when you see the forming potentially in early stages.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And then I'll mention briefly the black elephant. The elephant there, of course, is the idea of the elephant in the room. It's the thing that everyone sees but seems to be ignoring for a variety of reasons. So the 3 of them together are the elephant in the room, the thing that we know we should be dealing with, but we're not for a variety of reasons. The black swan, the thing that would have never occurred to us, the thing that's completely outside of our worldview because it's simply just too fantastical for us to imagine or seemingly impossible. And then the black jellyfish, which is the little thing that's quite familiar to us, but that can escalate or mutate or evolve into something quite radical that creates all kinds of disruptions, as Donna had mentioned. So the reason I like those 3 together, and the reason I use them together, is that it really forces the people kind of going through this as a mode of questioning to kind of challenge your convictions, to kind of be open to those contradictions, to kind of try to get into a space to think about, what are the new things, the novel considerations that, we should be paying attention to. And to make it practical, they've been put into 3 very simple questions. And I think these are questions that actually governments are forcing themselves to have to ask. And I think the governments that are clearly responding better to the crises that we're seeing unfold are asking precisely these kinds of questions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and like I love those questions because as a disaster management coach, like those are awesome questions.
They are very good questions, and these questions hit at different layers of uncertainty that we carry around that exist that we may not we are aware of it, but we don't necessarily perhaps work with it in a very conscious way. So it kind of forces you to kind of take a look at these layers of uncertainty and recognize that they exist, because these are the things that we carry with us into the future. So if we don't address them, they will continue to exert its presence moving into the future, and affect how we, how we potentially, the options that are available to shape the future for us.
Yeah, this is a really good framework for boards and those types of organizations to start with in terms of going through that process. And it's, like there's just a comment posted about, why are we looking at these general questions? How do we deal with them? Why don't we look at how do we deal with uncertainty instead of discussing black swans and other concepts? Well, this is how you deal with uncertainty. You spend your time evaluating your thinking, evaluating your beliefs, evaluating why you think what you think, and you be honest with yourself and address those elephants. And as long as you're open to discussing those, you'll start to come up with some pretty incredible answers that you never considered before. You'll start to find resources that you probably once had and haven't been using but could. And I would assume through a lot of this, and I don't know if you go into it today, but then you can start to get into developing definitions of success and things like that. So and starting to measure your work.
Yeah, I mean, these are really meant to be that starting point, like you said. So, Donna's really hit on the critical aspect of, this is about trying to engage and confront with how we navigate uncertainty. And so where I've seen these questions have a lot of utility, specifically within a policy space, is precisely when people disagree. So this is not an exercise in consensus necessarily. So if you imagine a team, or you imagine, you want to, have a small public engagement, or, you're just trying to, connect people. Someone will invariably say, this is a black elephant. And then someone will come and say, oh, for me, that's a black swan. And that's a fantastic conversation to have, because then we get in the kinds of assumptions that we bring to what it is that we're seeing and how it is that we're seeing it. And from a governance perspective, I think there's a lot of healthiness in having conversations about assumptions. Usually it's the exact opposite. In a governance context, nobody wants to talk about assumptions, right? We want to talk about how do we solve the problem, right? How do we find the next solution? But if we start to break down the assumptions, then that I think gets us to different kinds of questions. And I think now more than ever, the capacity to ask different kinds of questions and capacity to explore a little bit more the kinds of questions and that move us to consider uncertainty in different ways, I think has a lot of utility.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll just say sorry to that LinkedIn user who posted that question. On my end, sometimes I can only see it says LinkedIn user and there's no picture. Others, I can see their name and who it is. So if I know you, I apologize. I can't see who's submitting those questions here. But go ahead, Donna. What were you going to say?
Oh, no, I was just going to just add to what John said around assumptions, because I think that's very powerful to be able to recognize the assumptions. And I know best practice in public policy is to document your assumptions for any kind of recommendation. But sometimes we don't necessarily examine whether those assumptions are accurate. And this is an opportunity to challenge your assumptions. And a lot of foresight methodologies and futures methodologies really have that embedded into it, where it looks to challenge your assumptions about what you're proposing towards the future, and perhaps open up new possibility or new ideas that you never thought of before.
Yeah, and I mean, something that I did very often with the boards I chaired and my teams was, even before we got to this framework, it was about giving people the language to have those conversations, which I think is really what you're doing. It's because here's what typical managers do. Okay, team, give me some feedback. Let's talk about how things are going.
Yeah.
And everyone looks at each other and they're like, well, I'm not going to say it. I don't want to say it. Like, I need another 10 years here. I need my pension. Yeah. And then the manager walks out of the room and says, well, I asked for feedback. Nobody said anything. So, the hell with you. Too bad. You had your chance. Well, that doesn't work. So what you have to do is you have to first have the discussion with the team and say, okay, every 2 weeks, we're going to get together in this room and we're going to talk about what the black elephant is. And we're going to have an open, honest discussion. It's a safe space. I think Brene Brown calls it container building. You set the parameters for that room. You give people some tools to talk respectfully and to know that this is not about performance. This is about actually dealing with some very potential bad issues. And if you can create that space and walk into a room and say, everyone, let's talk about the black elephants today. Well, you're going to have a whole brand new conversation because everyone knows where to go and that it's safe. So that's why I love this kind of language, because you can build that culture of, let's talk about I think who's that? I forget his name. Shoot, Ray Dalio and his principles. If you look up Ray Dalio, he implemented a system with his company around giving feedback, and his staff were at the point where they were sending him emails like, "Hey Ray, in that last meeting, you came off pretty negative, and I think maybe next time if something's going on, just let us know." And they got to that point where they were getting that kind of feedback to each other, and they were high performing. So
it's great.
Yeah,
that's really
I love
great.
This. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, feedback in a system is powerful, because if you are missing feedback, or if your feedback is not accurate, then you're not able to take that knowledge and be able to mobilize it to improve whatever service or whatever offering you have. And so it's sometimes we don't always, or we're not open to feedback, but it's the most powerful thing if you can create a system that allows for that feedback and to use it in a very constructive way.
Yeah.
And it really does require, like you had said, Brad, there's a cultural dynamic within the organization that is quite critical and essential. I mean, when we were developing this as an approach, we were working in a variety of global contexts, and the context, of course, in let's say East Asia is quite different than you might find in, let's say, North America, if you want to have a conversation within an organization around what are most people missing or not seeing. So, it's going to look different in different places, but ultimately the opportunity to engage in open dialogue that allows us to get those assumptions out into the open, it allows us to have a little more complexity in how we think about uncertainty. Uncertainty, a lot of times organizations just like a switch. Oh, now things are uncertain. So, okay, now we go. But we fool ourselves when we think things are not uncertain. So thinking about it as a spectrum, thinking about it, and approaching it as something that is, evolving and shifting, and, seeing it as something that's not just this on, off. Now we're living in a time of radical uncertainty. Of course, we maybe feel that more, but, it is about, are we being open and honest, really about, what it is that we're seeing and how it is that we're seeing it. And I think now more than ever, organizations and governments specifically feel like this, that they are just barely holding it together. They're shooting the pipe of what is a monster wave, and feeling like they're having to confront these tsunamis of change. And clearly this year has been a banner example of that. But I think now more than ever, it is about trying to understand and make sense of the degree to which we are prepared to navigate these tsunamis of change. And I think the three animals or other frameworks that allow us to do that, I think governments are really opening to that. I wanted to mention that there was one government who actually put this into practice. So there's a group in the UK, the Ministry of Defense, that does the global strategic trends, and I had worked with them a few years ago, and they had integrated this as part of one of their reports. And what they had found was it was a way of having different conversations with some of their experts around some of the critical security issues that they were looking at within the context of the trends that they had reported on. So they actually included it in that report, the elephant, swan, and the jellyfish.
Yeah, and I think it's Eleco. I think, is it Eleco? I think I'll put his question up here, because I think it's trying to get at that tangible practices, maybe about how do you suggest we deal with the unreasonable? I don't know if this is really a scientific method. I like to call, I don't know, let me know, but I think it's just trying to relate to human beings through conversation and structure and framework. I don't know how scientific that is, but it's definitely structured. So any ideas on or suggestions on how we deal with the unreasonable outside of science? I don't want to get into religion.
Well, so my master's degree was in religion, actually. So my PhD was technically in political science with a degree in foresight. So my master's and my PhD are the two things you're not supposed to talk about at cocktail parties, right? Politics and religion.
Yeah.
I love this idea of the unreasonable, because now more than ever, and if you look at the crisis, how it's unfolded, whether we're thinking about QAnon conspiracy theories or misinformation, disinformation, it's no longer it's not just a public health crisis and we're dealing with that. It's this torrent of misinformation, disinformation. So I think it's precisely the opportunity to be more open about the kinds of chaos that is, right there at the, at just sort of, about to kind of bubble over that we need to really confront. And so I think that what I would say is that, this is, quote, scientific in that it's meant to bring some rigor to those conversations. I'm a trained social scientist, so, we are, of course, trying to build on practices, over the course of decades. And there's research, and we, share knowledge. And Donna's currently doing some phenomenal research in this area. So I think there can be rigor there. But I also say that it's probably more along the lines of what we would call a post-normal science, which is actually a field of science that has had an impact on policy a lot, mostly in the UK. But one thing that they do, and I'll mention this just briefly, is the whole notion of the extended peer community. So, scientists do their research, they get their data, they publish their findings. Post-normal science is saying, wait a second, how do we bring more people into those processes? Kind of back to what we had discussed in our previous session around participatory futures. How do we bring more people so we decenter the quote, the kind of, oh, this is what the experts say and that's it. But how do we understand values? How do we understand what communities want and need? With these kinds of bigger questions. And post-normal science really emerged in the 1980s as an interesting way to have different conversations about how policy should confront radical new technologies. So like genetic engineering at the time, and other sorts of questions. And I think now more than ever, governments need that capacity to ask those kinds of questions.
Absolutely. And just to add to John's comments, in emergency management, we're very science oriented. We have a history of we use past data, we look at information, we look at patterns, trends, and so we do a lot of forecasting. So a lot of our mindsets are all about prediction and about, what steps can we take to mitigate or control the situation. So it's a very different relationship and understanding towards the future. When you start to think about futures literacy and you start to think about what that looks like, we're really talking about how to work with emergence, right? How to understand what's happening in the broader horizon. And so it's not so quantitative, it's more qualitative and understanding those trends, those patterns, those forces that are shaping a broader macro environment that potentially can cause disruption. But on the other side of disruption could be new opportunities to adapt, evolve, transform what we're doing. And only if you're able to see beyond the very predictive mindset, then you're able to tap into a much wider lens and an area of possibility. And that's where a lot of companies that are leading innovation, they try to tap into that space to understand so that they're able to not only keep up with the pace of change, but actually get ahead and be the leader and the change maker in the space. So it's a different kind of mindset when you think of science. And I've been doing a fair bit of reading lately, related to my research on this and trying to understand that scientific mindset and what it means and how can we start to expand that thinking to include, more of an anticipatory lens that uses foresight, that uses anticipation in the context of emergence, novelty, and strategic thinking.
Yeah, and I love that, and I know there's probably a lot of people thinking right now, how do I carve out that time when my organization doesn't value that type of competency currently, and how do I just navigate the ability to spend time there when I'm expected to answer an email within 5 minutes of it dinging on my phone, or, every third email is so-and-so complaining about so-and-so. And it's a really tough thing. So so that's why I promote coaching so much, because coaching is a form of professional development and it carves out that time for people to think about the future. and it forces you in that space.
Mm-hmm.
And I think working with someone like you, Donna or John, that's the same type of thing. Like you show up, you create that space and time, and it forces people to do that, and then you can kind of put things together for them and come back with a result and keep moving, right? So very critical resource for a lot of organizations.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I what I love about the coaching and the mentoring relationships are it challenges you to be accountable to someone. So,
Yep.
you know, it's different if you have a one-off workshop or some kind of training, but like if you have a relationship and you're building that trust, then it really challenges you to be able to say, you know what, yeah, I missed something this week, or I didn't give myself the time, or I was overloaded and so I did this. And so it really challenges you to say, you know, to be honest and to make sure you commit. So when you show up to that meeting, you've done what you needed to do to prepare, right? Because it's
Yeah,
someone else's
like
time as well. And so I think the relational aspect.
yeah, one question that it stumps the people I
Sorry,
work with
go
all the
ahead.
time. Oh, yeah, I've just got a bit of lag. One question that stumps a lot of the people I work with that I ask is, okay, you said you're going to do this, so when we meet again, how are you going to show me that you've done that?
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, show you? Yeah, what are you going to bring to on our next meeting that will show me that you've committed yourself and done what you said you're going to do? Well, that just means they've got to come back with evidence, and that just brings it to a whole new level.
That's right.
Yeah.
So it's moving thinking into action, which is
absolutely
very powerful.
Yeah.
Very powerful. Yeah.
So if you've got questions out there, if you're just joining us, we're with Donna Dupont and John Sweeney talking about black jellyfish, black elephants, black swans. If you didn't catch the first part of this, you can rewind and get those definitions. And don't forget to text me by 1:30 p.m. Mountain Standard Time for your chance to win some tickets to communications and healthcare settings. I'll put the number up later, but yeah, just a reminder if you're just tuning in. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know what the other slide. Let's go into your next slide because that might answer a question I have. But if you're ready.
Yeah, so I this image came up earlier in the year, and I really loved it, of course, because at exactly the moment that we were having conversations, right, about how do we flatten the curve. Of course, you know, the black elephant, the elephant in the room is of course climate change. So, you know, and we saw that, of course, you know, whether we're talking about the fires or the flooding, you know, that have happened, you know, in a variety of contexts. So what I like about this image, and it makes me think about something that Donna said, you know, that the problem with forecasts is that for much of the time they're quite good. So they lure us in, right? They bring us in with that sense of, you know, confidence, of false confidence and understanding. And it's at exactly the moment that we need them most that they fail us, right? When it's the once in a century this, or, you know, the once in a decade that, which, as we know, is happening more and more and more often. So I love, this is something that Pierre Wack, who helped to set up scenarios at Shell, had said, that, you know, the aim is not to just be consumed by these forecasts. The aim is to be able to step outside and understand when we are being limited by the forecast that we might feel quite good about, but to be able to go beyond that as a mindset and as a practice, and to get out into the ether a little bit, to move into that radical possibility space. Because as we've seen increasingly, you know, the unthinkable, as it were, is becoming the unavoidable.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to build on that, a lot of times forecasting is, we're very comfortable with what we know, information we know, and that we can work with, and we tend to, you know, be very uncomfortable with the unknown. And so Foresight Futures is really all about the unknown and kind of going into that space, because there's a lot to understand within the broader context. So it helps to kind of fill in some of the blind spots that may exist from just a regular forecast.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, the forecasting piece, because that's what economists do, right? Like they forecast all sorts of things, and then we make major,
Mhm.
shareholders make major decisions on it, the markets react. But I mean, they're just forecasts. And it's like the weather, right? I could say, oh great,
Mhm.
it's going to be a great weekend. I'm going to start packing for my camping trip today, and I'm not going to take winter clothes. And then we get there and it's snowing. So yeah, I like that thought that forecasts lull us into this false sense of something, and it can go both ways, I suppose.
Mhm. Mhm.
You could get some really positive surprises if the forecast is bad and things work out. But yeah, I love that. That's
Forecasting is very helpful in the short term, especially if
yeah,
it's, stable parameters that we have a lot of information on. But as a system becomes more complex and there's more turbulence, forecasting, there's limitations to that information. And so just having that awareness of where those limitations are is very important. And then having that openness to explore uncertainty takes you into the next level of beyond just a planning paradigm and a management paradigm, but a strategic paradigm and a leadership paradigm, because now you are surfing the tsunamis of change, as John had mentioned earlier.
yeah,
And that's a very different perspective.
yeah, and and I get frustrated by the term post COVID. Like, when it and I still hear media and other people kind of say things like, when we get back after COVID, when we get back to normal. Well, I'm starting to forget what normal was like on, September, like 1 year ago today.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
kind of don't
Yeah.
quite remember. It's like this fading sense of something. And so, um, I don't know what that's going to mean, like in 2 years from now, if a vaccine showed up tomorrow and everyone was vaccinated by Christmas.
Mhm.
Like, there's not going to be a normal as it was pre-COVID.
I think there's already been a lot of change, set in motion, and there's been a lot of, consequences as a result of just responding to COVID for such a protracted, long crisis as it's been, just from an economic and social and mental health, and so I think, I think it's going to be, the implications, the consequences of this was probably going to last for some time.
Yeah, and just
Yeah,
the
and
mental, like you said earlier, yeah.
oh, no, I was going to just say, Brad, I think you made a great point. The whole idea of post-COVID, the whole idea of the new normal, which is a term that got used a lot, it says a heck of a lot more about us than it does about the reality of things. And what it says is that we have this preternatural need to make it this digestible thing that we easily understand, and we put it into a certain box, and we've named it, we've titled it, and so we're living through this time where things are changing, but by naming it this, we've given it a lot of comfort. And the same actually was true of the kinds of metaphors of war and conflict and combat that were used to talk about the virus, right? The virus is the silent enemy. We're fighting the war against this. So a certain kind of mindset kicks in that brings certain kinds of options or possibilities to bear just by the language that we're using. And we all saw it, right? In March and April and May, these proliferation of things. What are the post-COVID scenarios? What are the new normals? What's the next sort of black swan? And I think ultimately, like, again, being honest about how that's underlied by certain assumptions, and being open about that and being able to engage with those are really quite critical.
Yeah, like in Alberta right now, the Auditor General just released a report that said the government of Alberta, they stopped doing their provincial hazard risk assessment like almost 4 years ago. And so, like, that's been the elephant in Alberta's room for quite a long time is, how can we be moving forward and saying we're going to do better with mitigation, prevention, and identifying risks and hazards if we can't even work together as a government to come together and define a methodology for what type of assessment we're going to do, and then let alone have all those departments actually start to work together to bring the data and the information that's needed to put that assessment together.
Yeah.
I mean, it took the Auditor General a year and a half. COVID interrupted a bit of the work, I'm sure, but a year and a half to get to the point where they're saying, look, you're not doing anything. Well, people knew that for like 4 years before that. So, but now that's allowing us to say, here's the elephant, let's talk about it, and that conversation is starting.
Mm-hmm.
But
That's
now
good.
I'm starting to think, what is next, right? What's the next elephant?
Yeah.
I mean, I have
And
ideas, but
well, and you know, if you look at places that were extraordinarily proactive, you know, like Taiwan, for example, and their 140-point action plan as part of their crisis response, it took them going through, you know, the first avian flu to be able to, you know, confront and to, you know, to realize that more needed to be done. Early warning systems, you know, dramatic action plan, dynamic engagement, public engagement plans as well, to be able to prepare for that. So, you know, if governments are going to say, all right, you know, we're going to take our lumps, we're going to do the best we can, but we're really going to try to learn from this and put, you know, a lot into practice, then there's a lot of value in that, because, you know, as with this image, right, the next wave is already coming. And I would love to hear the black elephant that you have in mind.
well, I mean, it's again, it's kind of around that idea of, okay, once we get a hazard assessment, like, who's responsible for it at the end of the day? Like, I know there's going to be, you know, environment's going to have to do this for flood mitigation, and wildfire or forestry will have to do this for this event.
Yeah.
And like, a big one is cybersecurity in the province. Like, okay, government of Alberta, how are you addressing that threat? While like the CRA just got hit by a stuffing attack in August, right? Hundreds of thousands of usernames and passwords were run through their system that were collected from other sources, and that was just in August. So that's my big worry. Is why aren't we talking about that threat? We tend to focus on flood, fire, but let's talk about the digital threats. And so that's one of them,
which is emerging, definitely, and it's continuing to accelerate. It's a whole new domain for emergency management, and it's actually in itself, there's a lot to learn around cybersecurity. A lot of expertise. But what you're talking about with respect to the hazard assessment is also, it's all about governance, right? And that was a big theme this year for the International Disaster Risk Reduction Day, is governance and systemic risk governance. But also, I think governance is not just about measuring and about calculating. It's also about transparency and accountability. And so, you know, there may be new ways that we can share information to, you know, have more transparency about the risks that are present in the system and the different responsibilities with all the different partners, because we're moving towards a whole of society type response. That's the new paradigm shift that the Sendai framework talks about. And that's a very different structure and model from what we're working with today. So we have to reimagine, if we are going to move to a whole of society response, and we're going to have the shared responsibility of risk, what does that look like? How do we work together in a very different way? And how are we going to share information in a secure way, but also maintaining transparency and accountability? Those are really some really big questions moving forward within the profession.
Yeah, and I would say, like, if someone's listening right now and you are on a board or you're a chair or on a committee, one thing you can start, one small step, and correct me if I'm wrong, but one small step you can take right now is call a colleague at another organization and have that conversation about ask them what their risks are, and outline what yours are. And then look for areas where you can work together to control those risks, because maybe you've got some resources they need, maybe they have something that you need, and have that initial conversation of, let's just talk about our vulnerability for a little while, and the exposure that's there, and then let's see where we can work together. And you know what? You may not be a good match. It's kind of like the dating game. Like you may not be able to help each other, and that's okay. So move on to somebody else, or connect that other person into your network and refer them to someone else. But just have that conversation.
Absolutely. And I think with COVID-19, oh, sorry, John.
No, go ahead.
With COVID-19, we've seen some really interesting examples of engaging private sector in different ways to support, different issues we've had with equipment and supply chains. And so, we should also recognize those lessons learned and build on those particular partnerships to see how they can support us moving into the future with a variety of different kinds of potential emergency situations.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I love that metaphor. I certainly feel like I learned more about myself from a bad date than I did from a good date. Yeah. So, the whole idea of that really, that kind of an experience reifies what's important to you. And it reifies, how it is that you're seeing things and where you are and the situation and context. So like that, there's a lot of value, I think, in that. So I think that's a great metaphor.
Yeah, and another another tip for boards, if you're looking for a first small step, like look and see when the last time you did a board composition analysis. I've got a toolbox. I've got a worksheet on my website where it walks you through a process of looking at your board, the current membership, the criteria for the membership, and then you can start to like look at, based on our risks, here's the skill sets that we need to start bringing in maybe. And so when we do our next round of bringing in board members, maybe we're not going to bring in all of the same type of people, but we're going to start to diversify our board, bring in others. It could be different age demographics, education, skill sets, experiences, whatever it is. Take a hard look at the makeup of your committee or board and start to ask those really tough questions now. Yeah. Because it's a long process to change a board and bring in new skill sets and diversity.
I like that a lot, Brad. I think diversity is so important, especially with the complex challenges that exist in today's world. You need a variety of different perspectives. And when those come together in different ways, you can really open up and unlock new ideas. It can be very powerful.
Yeah. You have to do it. And like I've been asked to sit on some boards and I've said no, and I've referred them to other people that are going to bring something that a middle-aged white guy from Alberta, like there's already 10 of those people on the board. So go talk to someone in an Indigenous community, or go talk to somebody from a different background, but don't bring in another. Have something in place that catches you before you make that offer, right? It's really hard, right? And so, yeah, I just encourage boards all the time to do that hard look. Okay, you've got one more slide. Let's go into that one.
That's just the thank you slide. That's all. So I'll stop sharing my screen. But
yeah, I think Donna froze. Did Donna freeze on you? She froze on me.
Yeah, she did. She did freeze.
Okay, I'll just take her out for a quick second. When she comes back on, I'll bring her on so we're not staring at her face. So I don't know if you're out there still with us. If you've got questions or comments, please let us know. I know something that John said on our last conversation that really stuck with me is ideas are critical infrastructure. And I tell that to people all the time, because you've got to create that time and space to ask those hard questions, to come up with more ideas, so you can keep innovating and moving forward. What tools are out there? Can you forward us to any tools?
Yeah, I've got a kind of my goodie box, if you will, of stuff. So I'm happy to share some tools and resources for that. And actually, I will say this: we're living in the golden age of toolkits. When I need a little bit of a refresher, or I feel like I want to spice up my practice, I have this sort of, I call it my Dropbox junk drawer of stuff, and I'll just go and try something out, and that really challenges and forces me to look at something from a different perspective. So I often rely on, because again, a large part of my work is already trying to move people to the imagination idea space.
Right.
I like that kind of the introduction of the random. So, sometimes I use random cards or use, dice to kind of shake things up a little bit.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of utility with that, because, the crises, like you mentioned there, it's not just one of dealing with the challenges, but of imagination itself. And so we do have to be intentional in our own practice to make sure that we are trying to continuously grow that as a muscle, because imagination is a muscle, and we can make it stronger if we commit to different practices to help strengthen it.
So walk us through, maybe, like, if let's just say I'm an emergency management professional at a senior executive level, and I'm about to bring my team together for an annual meeting or something. What would be a really good activity to kind of spark some of that discussion that maybe you normally wouldn't have? Is there anything off the top of your head? Putting you on the spot.
Yeah. So one of my favorite games is called the Pollock Game. So it was based on the work of a futurist, Fred Pollock, who wrote a book called The Image of the Future, and he had a really interesting hypothesis. This is back in the 70s or 60s, and it was the age of kind of big theory. And his whole idea was, if a civilization or a society has a positive view of the future, that leads to certain kind of flourishing. And the other side of that argument is, if a society has a backward-looking view of things, and that's going to lead to decline. And so the Pollock game uses this simple matrix of agency versus the whole idea of destiny. The future is just going to unfold a certain way, or we can shape the future, and optimism and pessimism. And so you create, very simply, 4 different quadrants. And then the game works that you get into pairs, or if you have 4 people, each of them takes on one of that and creates a persona and makes an argument that the future is either, again, something we can shape and is positive, or negative, or the future is just going to happen. And so, like, it's a really simple game, but it's really profound because people really get into it. And the whole point of the game is, can you convince people to join you just based on the arguments? So not on personal preference, but just based on the arguments. And so I can share some information about that game, but I use it all the time, and I really like it. It's really powerful.
Yeah, if you could throw that in the comments in the event page under this feed, that would be awesome. I don't know if where Donna, she must have lost her connection, so she's probably trying to get back in. Her internet dropped. Yeah, she just texted me, so we'll give her a couple minutes. I don't know, and so here's kind of, I think, if you're a manager, senior manager out there, like, it takes a lot of work to run these types of games and do the research on and find them. And you really have to be willing to kind of bring your team in and experiment with some of these things to get that discussion going. But I mean, even though you're going to see a tiny little bit of a productivity loss as you yourself are trying to find some of these games or activities and then learn about them and then try and facilitate them, once you get going, you're going to have data and information and thoughts and ideas from your team that are going to be, they're just going to propel you forward in terms of performance in the future. So take the time now to learn some of these things and use them. That's my big pitch for that stuff. Okay, so you've got I'll
like
take this link. Yep.
Okay, great. Yeah, and like you said, a lot of this has a bit of a learning curve, but trust me, if I'm doing this, none of this stuff is rocket science. And for people who are skilled already at running meetings, or are skilled as facilitators, a lot of this is just just doing it a few times and feeling comfortable, and also localizing it to your particular context, or the particular group that you want to run it with. So I think that there is a lot of utility in experimenting with these different approaches, and again, making that part of the culture. So if everybody knows we're going to start a meeting and we're always going to have this 15 or 20 minute piece where we're going to do things a little bit differently, where we are going to, look at a game or an exercise or a toolkit, and we're just going to commit to doing that. I think the normalization of a lot of this is what's really important, to just bring it into the practice and say that this is something that we're going to do because it's important.
Yeah. What's on your radar for a Black Swan event?
So because I lived in Hawaii for 9 years, the quintessential Black Swan is the whole notion of the mega tsunami. So, of course, the San Andreas Fault and the whole West Coast is a bit shaky, but there's this idea that if there were to be a major earthquake, and let's say, for example, it could create a mega tsunami, and we've already seen this happen. We have the geologic record, but the whole notion of a wave that could decimate, of course, potentially the Hawaiian Islands, and then have a major impact and effect on people living in low-lying coastal regions. There was one thing that has always struck me, and I always have used this in different contexts. So of course the IPCC reports look at a variety of different scenarios, and there was one in particular around low-lying coastal regions, and what they found was that by the 2080s, somewhere between 1.8 and 5.2 billion people might have to relocate if we see a significant rise in extreme weather and storm surges. Again, not just sea level rise, but just from storm surges and from extreme weather events. So that number is unbelievable. By the 2080s, I mean, we're talking 60 years, 5 billion people.
Billion.
It's
just from storms.
Billion, yeah. Exactly. So the potentiality, I mean, you look at some of the most urban dense places in the world, like Dhaka, or you look at, a variety of, Asian megacities on coastal regions. It's quite extraordinary to it. But I think that's the scale of kind of black swans and elephants that we're seeing. I mean, the potentiality here is pretty radical because we've unfortunately got a lot of fragility with climate change that we're facing. So the idea, of course, is to build more anti-fragile systems, but that's going to take a lot of work. I mean, there are no simple solutions to some of these radical problems.
No, and that's why I love working in virtual reality, because you can build a virtual model of what would Los Angeles look like after a mega tsunami in 5 years. And you can actually build that and walk into a neighborhood, and suddenly where you had nice beachfront property, there's maybe like a 40-foot concrete retaining wall. Like, you can go in and experience that at a certain level, and it starts to really kind of sit with you about getting ready for that change, and you can start to see the impact it has on property values, and you can start to ask these questions about, what's it going to look like? California could never get back to a beach after a mega tsunami because they're all now gone, or they're just concrete retaining walls.
Yeah.
And so
exactly.
it's a crazy thing to build up these types of environments and then be able to enter into them. There we go. Donna's back, and start living it.
Yeah, I agree.
There we go.
I do.
Hello.
Welcome back.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. We're just talking about mega tsunamis and John's Black Swan event of Hawaii getting crushed by a mega tsunami, and how we can start to use virtual reality to build these actual realities and walk through them.
I love that idea, John. I've always been fascinated by that in terms of the scenarios we create in futures, and how we can create that in virtual reality so that participants can go and experience a different future and really understand it in a very different way.
Yeah, I think, Brad had a really good point. It allows people to live and breathe in those worlds. And I think that's the one thing that actually is the most important part of using even scenarios as an approach, is not to make it this fantastical thing, but to give people a sense of the everyday. And that is really where I think it has a lot of power. If people can understand this different world, this different future, post this radical, crisis, or post this, huge hazard, and things look completely different, but they understand what day-to-day life, then they connect with it a bit more. It's not just this kind of, 30,000 foot exercise. It's not just words on a page, but people have a greater sense of connectedness to what those risks are, and what the shifts are that need to provide the kind of resilience for people to survive and thrive in those worlds.
Yeah, I want to start live streaming news broadcasts from like 2035 or 2040.
Oh, that's amazing.
Right,
I love
right?
that.
Yeah,
I love
like,
that idea.
yeah, like talking about, like, in Canada, it's let's talk about the new Canadian Emergency Management College. It's the year 2035. They've just elected a new board, and voting has just been completed. Now all emergency management professionals must have, this post-secondary education, and like, just getting into some of those things and starting to have these news broadcasts to talk about it. Like, I think that'd be awesome.
That would be great. And like, that's in futures, and John can probably add to this, is there's a lot of different tools that we use, and one is artifacts from the future, to really take something that people might see in their everyday life, but it's different. It's somehow presented differently in a future context, and so it really opens up a space for dialogue. And I love newspapers from the future, headlines from the future, because that really can you can really play with that a lot, and you can put things that might be a little shocking or that people may not have expected, but it can open up opportunity to have some amazing conversations, and maybe some deeper insights on the decisions that we need to make today if we don't want that future to happen.
Yeah, like it'd be
exactly.
awesome to hear like go ahead, John.
No, I was gonna say that there are some really great models for this as well, so we can share some resources, because actually, it's a great team exercise to create a newspaper from the future. It's a great activity for people to have that space. And I also love the idea of the news stories from the future, and we've seen a few places do this already. It's there was one a few years ago that was reporting Europe over the summer, and the first kind of 50-degree kind of normal summer. What is that going to look like across southeastern Europe? And so again, the opportunity to use different touch points to connect with people, and not just have it be a technical report, not just have it be a set of words on a page, but to leverage the full availability of resources that we have for this. It's it just makes perfect sense, and there's so many good examples now.
Yeah, my friend Tom Cox at the Alberta Emergency Management Agency, he'd always say, write your after action report before the disaster. And so it's that idea of, it's that futurist thinking about, write your post incident assessment before the disaster, and then start your work.
So it's more of an aspirational scenario of what they want that action report to say about them. Yeah,
like communications went really well, or we had all the resources possible. We had too many resources. Like that's pie in the sky, but getting down to that level of, okay, if the disaster is going to be this, here's how we want the after action report to read, as opposed to having the event and then writing it. I love that.
It's like a preferred future a little bit, right? Of what you want in terms of the outcome for this event, and it's good to have that, because it acts as a bit of a North Star in terms of, this is what we're aiming towards, and if we see things that are heading in a different direction, then we know we have to course correct.
Absolutely. And if you're a politician listening, think about being able to write your own future like that. Geez, eh? Like there's a, what is it? Think and Grow Rich. That book, Think and Grow Rich. Yes. I forget the author. But that whole idea of creating your reality just through, visualization and setting it up in the future, writing your own story, it's totally possible. I mean, I like exactly 18 months ago, I'm like, on November 18th, 2020 at 1:18, I'll be mentioning this to Donna and John. I didn't. It's not that detailed. I didn't do that. But
Wow.
yeah, I did. Okay, well, where can people find you both?
Yeah.
If they want to learn more, want to get in touch with you, what's the best way?
Well, the best way to reach me is by email. So my email is donna@purplecompass.ca, and I also have a website, purplecompass.ca. So feel free to take a look at the website, as well as send me an email if you have any questions.
Yeah, I'm definitely on LinkedIn, and I'm also at aloha_futures on Twitter. And that's the best way to track me down. And yeah, would love to stay connected with everyone. And I'll definitely share some resources.
Yeah, and John and I work closely together. John is, has been and so actually today is 3 years since I launched Purple Compass. So it's been an amazing journey working with John and. Thank you. It's been a wonderful journey, working with John and futurists from all over the world and meeting, emergency managers, across Canada and bringing all of these amazing networks together. So it's been a pleasure the last 3 years, and such an area of so much growth has happened, and I'm really excited for continuing forward and for 2021. I'm optimistic that we will surf the tsunamis of change and find our way. So I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, and I appreciate you both coming to do this, because I think the expertise and the services that your field brings into a lot of areas is critical. And so again, if you're listening, reach out to Donna and or John and just book them for a call and have a conversation about how they can support you, because it will make a world of difference. I think even just the stress release of knowing that you're really planning for that far out and starting to shape that future, is that guiding light, like you said before. I think it was John that said that. That guiding light is so important. It's like being able to light your own fire.
Yeah.
Right? When you're out stuck, lost somewhere, and you've got nothing, but you have the confidence to light your own fire, fire just makes everybody happier. So it's kind of like that.
I like that. It's powerful.
Okay. All right. Well, everyone, I'd like to again thanks Dawn and Jonna for coming on. We will have them on again, and we will be recording this. So if you missed a piece
Brad.
of it, pardon. I've still got a little bit of lag. Thank you. You're welcome. If you said thank you.
Thank you,
this
Brad,
will be recorded.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. This will be recorded, so if you missed a piece of it, it'll be up on the YouTube channel, and we'll throw it around LinkedIn and other social media. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in. John, Donna, have a good day, and stay connected.
Thanks so much, Brad. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.